A young black girl was detained by the police without evidence, based only on preconceived suspicions. Everything seemed to be going according to their script until they found out who her father was. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. Amelia's morning began with a warm glow filtering through her window, illuminating her room and gently pulling her from sleep. Today was her day off, a rare, precious Saturday she'd planned for herself. The rest of her week had been dedicated to studies, group projects, and preparation for an upcoming presentation, one she hoped would help secure her a place in a prestigious internship program. But today, she was free from all that. She lay in bed for a few minutes, letting herself drift in and out of relaxed thoughts. Her room, which she loved, was her sanctuary. The walls were adorned with posters of her role models, mostly women who had defied odds in various fields. Some were activists, others entrepreneurs, and a few were even fictional heroines from books she'd read. She had put these posters up over the years, and now they felt like a part of her, reminders of the strength she wanted to embody. As she got out of bed, she passed by a small shelf that held her awards and trophies from high school. Each one represented years of dedication and hard work. She thought back to how her father had always encouraged her to push herself, to never settle for anything less than her best. His influence ran deep, though she sometimes felt the weight of it. He was a police captain, a man of iron principles, and had raised her with a sense of justice and dignity. After a quick breakfast, she decided that today was the day she'd finally buy herself a new jacket. She'd been eyeing one in the display window of her favorite store downtown, a sleek, stylish jacket that, in her mind, symbolized the person she was becoming, confident, unique, and ready to take on the world. She got dressed, choosing an outfit she felt comfortable in, jeans, a soft turtleneck, and her favorite sneakers. Practical, but she liked how it made her feel put together. Her journey downtown was peaceful. The city was alive but calm, a gentle hum of activity as people went about their Saturday routines. The streets were lined with trees that were just starting to show the golden hues of early autumn. She passed by familiar sights, coffee shops, bookstores, and little boutiques, each one holding memories of moments shared with friends or days spent wandering alone. She felt a deep connection to this city, to these streets that had shaped so much of her young life. As she reached the store, she felt a sense of excitement bubble up inside her. The shop's window display was artfully arranged with the latest fashion, and there it was. The jacket she'd come for, elegantly draped on a mannequin. She stepped inside, savoring the cool air and the soft hum of background music. The store was spacious, with rows of neatly organized clothing racks, each item hanging with a kind of pristine precision. Amelia wandered through the aisles, enjoying the feeling of fabrics beneath her fingertips, studying the colors and cuts. She was in no rush. Today was her day, and she intended to take her time. She reached the rack where the jacket hung and carefully pulled it off the hanger. Holding it up to herself, she studied her reflection in a nearby mirror, tilting her head thoughtfully. It was perfect, exactly what she'd imagined. However, as she tried on the jacket, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She caught a glimpse of the store's security guard, a stern-looking man with graying hair, standing near the entrance. He seemed to be glancing in her direction, and she quickly looked away, telling herself it was nothing. He was just doing his job, she thought. But as she continued browsing, she noticed him reappearing in different parts of the store, his eyes occasionally drifting toward her. It was subtle, but unmistakable. She felt a prickling sensation of discomfort, but tried to ignore it. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She had as much right to be there as anyone else. Amelia moved toward another section of the store, looking at a display of scarves and gloves, but she couldn't fully enjoy herself. The guard's presence had unsettled her, casting a shadow over what had started as a joyful, carefree outing. She wondered if she was being overly sensitive, if maybe she was imagining things. But the more she tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, the more she noticed his eyes following her. Finally, she decided she'd had enough. She was just about to put the jacket back on the rack when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned and saw the guard heading directly toward her. His expression was serious, and there was an unmistakable edge to his gaze. "Ma'am," he said, his tone stiff and formal, "I need to ask you to come with me." Amelia felt a surge of confusion mixed with a flicker of indignation. She hadn't done anything wrong. "Excuse me?" she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The guard glanced around as if to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in slightly. "I need you to step aside so we can have a word. You've been acting suspiciously." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "Suspiciously? I'm just shopping," she replied, feeling her cheeks flush with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She looked around, noticing a few other customers casting curious glances in her direction. "Ma'am, please," the guard said, his voice more insistent this time. "We've had issues with shoplifting recently, and I need to verify that you're not here for other reasons." The implication hit her like a slap. She could feel her anger rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I haven't stolen anything. I was about to put this jacket back and leave," she said, holding the jacket out as if to prove her innocence. The guard didn't seem moved. He folded his arms, looking at her with an expression that was both skeptical and impatient. "If that's the case, it won't take long. We just need to ask you a few questions." Amelia felt trapped, her frustration mounting as she looked around, hoping someone would intervene, but the other shoppers quickly averted their eyes. With no other choice, she followed the guard toward a small room at the back of the store, her mind racing with disbelief and humiliation. How could a simple day of shopping turn into this? Inside the small, dimly lit room, the guard closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit down. Amelia remained standing, crossing her arms defiantly. "Look," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm here to buy a jacket. That's it." The guard held up his hand, cutting her off. "We've had reports of theft in this store recently, and you fit the description of someone who's been involved. I need to know if there's anything you're not telling me." Amelia felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "Fit the description?" she echoed. "What's that supposed to mean?" The guard shrugged. "Young, dark hair, around your height. You can see why we'd be cautious." The implication was clear, and it felt like a punch to the gut. Amelia had heard about situations like this, read about them in the news, but she'd never imagined she'd find herself in one. She struggled to keep her voice steady as she replied, "I'm not a thief. I came here to shop, just like everyone else." The guard's expression remained skeptical. "Then you won't mind if we take a quick look at your bag." Amelia hesitated, every fiber of her being resisting the demand. She knew she hadn't taken anything, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. But she also knew that refusing would only make things worse. Slowly, reluctantly, she opened her bag and handed it to him. The guard rummaged through her belongings, taking his time as if hoping to find something incriminating. When he finally finished, he looked up at her with a slight frown. "You're free to go," he said, his tone dismissive, as if he'd just wasted his time. Amelia's hands trembled as she took her bag back, her mind reeling with anger and humiliation. She wanted to say something, to demand an apology, but she knew it would be useless. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, out of the store, and back into the open air, feeling as if she'd left a part of herself behind. Amelia walked briskly down the sidewalk, her heart pounding from the encounter. What was supposed to be a simple, relaxing day had turned into a nightmare. She clenched her fist, replaying the guard's words in her mind, her face still flushed with embarrassment and anger. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the weight of the accusation had attached itself to her. Despite the humiliation, she tried to convince herself that it was over, that she could leave the incident behind her. But a shadow of doubt clung to her thoughts, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the guard or someone else from the store to follow her. Her mind spiraled, wondering if people had been watching her, judging her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and that feeling only grew stronger with every minute. Just as she started to regain a sense of composure, Amelia heard a shout. She froze, her heart skipping a beat, and turned to see two police officers approaching. They moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable but focused. She glanced around, hoping they were there for someone else, but their eyes were fixed on her. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a gruff demeanor, stepped forward. "Miss, we need to speak with you," he said, his voice cold and formal. Amelia felt a rush of anxiety. She took a steadying breath, trying to keep her voice calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man exchanged a quick look with his partner, a younger woman who seemed slightly uncomfortable. "We received a report of suspicious activity at the store back there. You fit the description of a suspect in recent shoplifting incidents. I'm going to have to ask you to come with us for questioning." The accusation struck her like a blow. She felt a wave of indignation mixed with disbelief. "I didn't steal anything," she protested, her voice shaken. "I was just shopping. I even showed the guard my bag. He saw there was nothing in it." The younger officer stepped forward, her tone softer but still firm. "We understand that, but we need to make sure. If you cooperate, this shouldn't take too long." Amelia looked around, noticing a few onlookers beginning to gather, their curious gazes making her feel like she was on display. The shame and frustration built up inside her, but she fought to keep her composure. "Fine," she said, clenching her jaw, "but I didn't do anything wrong." The officers nodded, and one of them gestured for her to follow. As they led her to their car, Amelia felt a surge of embarrassment wash over her. She could almost feel the judgmental eyes of the onlookers piercing through her, as if they were already convinced of her guilt. She tried to hold her head high, to remind herself that she had nothing to be ashamed of, but it was difficult to shake the feeling of humiliation. Once inside the police car, she sat in silence, staring out the window, her mind racing. Her anger simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing minute. She had always believed that if she followed the rules, treated people with respect, and kept her head down, she would be safe. But now, she was beginning to see the cracks in that belief. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity, each minute stretching painfully as her mind swirled with a mix of disbelief, frustration, and a growing sense of betrayal. She thought about her father, about how he had always taught her to believe in justice and to trust in the system. But right now, it felt like that very system had turned against her. When they finally arrived, the officers led her through the cold, sterile halls of the station. She could feel the stares of a few officers and other employees as she walked by, each glance a silent accusation. Her stomach churned, and she could feel the beginnings of panic rising within her. She wanted to scream, to demand that someone listen to her, but she held back, knowing that it would only make things worse. They led her into a small, dimly lit room with a single table and 2 chairs. One of the officers gestured for her to sit, and she complied, her back rigid and her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She felt trapped, like an animal cornered with no way out. The officers sat across from her, their expressions impassive. The gruff one spoke first. "All right, let's start from the beginning. What were you doing in that store today?" Amelia took a deep breath, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I was shopping. That's it. I wanted to buy a jacket. I've been looking at it for a while, and I finally had a day off, so I decided to go and try it on." The younger officer scribbled something in a notebook, glancing up at her occasionally. "And you didn't take anything? Nothing at all?" "No," Amelia replied, her voice sharp with frustration. "I didn't take anything. The guard even checked my bag and saw that I had nothing. He just assumed I was up to something because of how I look." She hesitated, feeling the weight of her words. The officers exchanged a glance, and she felt a surge of anger. They didn't believe her. She could see it in their eyes, in the subtle way they shifted in their seats. No matter what she said, they had already made up their minds. The gruff officer leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Look, Miss Amelia, right? We just want to make sure we cover all our bases. There's been a series of thefts in that area, and you happen to fit the description. If you cooperate, this can be resolved quickly." Amelia felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to scream, to tell them how unfair this was, how absurd it was to be treated like a criminal for simply existing. But she forced herself to stay calm, knowing that losing her temper would only make things worse. "I don't know what else you want me to say," she replied, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to go home." The younger officer glanced at her partner, and for a moment Amelia thought she saw a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold, professional mask. The woman scribbled a few more notes, then looked up. "We're going to need you to stay here for a little while longer," she said, "just until we can verify a few things." Amelia's heart sank. She felt trapped, powerless, like her life was no longer her own. She looked down at her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, and tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. She couldn't believe this was happening to her. Amelia sat alone in the dim, cold room at the police station, the metallic hum of the fluorescent lights above adding to the sterile, unwelcoming atmosphere. She could still feel the weight of disbelief and humiliation pressing down on her, the echoes of the officer's accusations ringing in her ears. How could a day that had begun with such simplicity, just a trip to the store, have spiraled so completely out of control? She glanced around the small interrogation room, noting the worn, scuffed surface of the table, the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. Her eyes landed on the narrow, uncomfortable bench she was sitting on, and she felt the raw edges of her anger resurfacing, a burning sense of injustice. She felt violated, stripped of her dignity, simply for being herself. Her thoughts drifted back to her father. He had raised her to believe in justice, in the importance of the law. His influence had been a constant in her life, instilling in her the belief that honesty, hard work, and respect for authority were virtues that would protect her. But sitting here now, the lines between right and wrong, justice and injustice, blurred before her eyes. Could this really be the system he had devoted his life to? The door opened suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. A young officer walked in, holding a clipboard and casting a brief, uncertain glance in her direction before taking a seat across from her. Amelia could tell he was new. The nervous energy in his movements and the faint, hesitant look in his eyes were giveaways. He cleared his throat, seeming uncomfortable. "Miss," he glanced at the clipboard. "Amelia, right?" She nodded, suppressing a surge of irritation. She'd already gone through this once with the other officers. Each new person who came in with the same questions only deepened her sense of frustration. The officer gave a small, awkward cough, avoiding her gaze. "I just need to ask a few questions, and then we'll see what happens from there." His tone was softer than the others, almost apologetic, though he avoided making any direct promises. Amelia looked him straight in the eye, trying to find a shred of empathy, someone who might believe her side of the story. "Look, I've already told the other officers I didn't steal anything. I was just shopping. The guard didn't like the way I looked, and now I'm here. That's all there is to it." The officer nodded slowly, listening as he scribbled a note, though his face remained expressionless. "I understand that's your statement, but I need you to answer a few questions all the same." The following minutes were filled with a repetitive, exhausting back and forth, each question feeling more pointed and invasive than the last. It was clear he was trying to catch her in some inconsistency, probing for gaps in her story. Amelia responded each time, her anger flaring, yet she forced herself to remain calm, to answer as clearly as she could, even as the questions grew increasingly trivial and invasive. Finally, the young officer closed his notebook, looking slightly relieved as he rose from his seat. "Thank you for cooperating," he said, his voice still uncertain. I hope this all gets resolved soon." Amelia watched him leave, feeling the familiar frustration settle back over her like a weight. She felt abandoned, as though her life, her experiences, and her truth had been reduced to just another checkbox on a list, a case to be processed. And now, with no one to advocate for her, she was left alone with her thoughts, trapped in this cold, isolating place. Time passed slowly, the hours stretching endlessly. With nothing to do but sit and wait, her mind began to drift. She found herself thinking about her childhood, about all the lessons her father had taught her about strength and resilience. She remembered how, as a young girl, she would listen eagerly to his stories about his work, tales of bravery and justice, of how he helped people in need and protected those who couldn't protect themselves. One memory, in particular, floated to the surface. She was 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, her father across from her, his police badge resting in his hand. He had been telling her about a difficult day on the job, about a moment where he'd had to make a tough decision. She had listened with wide eyes, hanging on to his every word, admiring his unwavering sense of duty. "Amelia," he had said, his voice serious, "being a police officer isn't always about catching bad guys. It's about upholding the law, yes, but it's also about treating people with respect, with dignity. Never forget that. The badge I wear is a symbol of trust, not power." That memory now felt painfully ironic, a reminder of the ideal she had once held so close. Her father's words seemed hollow, their meaning diluted by the reality she was facing. Where was the respect, the dignity he had spoken of? Hours passed, and the sense of isolation deepened. Amelia's stomach rumbled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. She doubted anyone here cared enough to offer her food. She closed her eyes, focusing on breathing slowly, hoping it would keep her emotions in check. She couldn't afford to break down. Not here, not now. As evening settled in, the door opened once more. This time it was a different officer, a woman with a kind face and soft eyes. She looked slightly out of place in the harsh, sterile environment of the police station, and Amelia felt a faint glimmer of hope, though she quickly tempered it. "Amelia, right?" the woman asked, her voice gentler than the others. She took a seat across from her expression warm but professional. "I'm Officer Lynn." Amelia nodded, watching her warily. She didn't know if she could trust this woman, but she was grateful for even a hint of kindness after the endless cycle of questioning. "Amelia, I know this has been difficult," Officer Lynn began, her voice calm and steady. "I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but I want you to know that I'm here to help." Amelia felt a flicker of relief, though she remained guarded. "Help?" she echoed, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "Yes," Officer Lynn replied, her tone gentle. "I've been reviewing the reports, and, well, let's just say I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm here to see if there's anything I can do to make this right." Amelia swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to believe her, to cling to the possibility that someone in this place might finally see her side. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice cracking slightly. I was just shopping." Officer Lynn nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I believe you, Amelia," she said softly, "but we have procedures we have to follow. I know that might not make sense, and it certainly doesn't make it right, but I promise I'm going to do everything I can to clear this up." The words offered a faint glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, someone cared enough to listen. Amelia felt tears prick at her eyes, and she quickly looked away, not wanting to show any vulnerability. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I just want to go home." Officer Lynn reached across the table, her hand resting reassuringly on top of Amelia's. "I'll do my best to make that happen," she said, her voice full of sincerity. "Just hold on a little longer. I'm going to see what I can do." With that, Officer Lynn stood up, giving Amelia a small nod before leaving the room. For the first time since she had arrived at the station, Amelia felt a sliver of hope, a faint glimmer of light in the overwhelming darkness. As the night dragged on, Amelia tried to hold on to that hope even as exhaustion and frustration weighed heavily on her. She replayed Officer Lynn's words in her mind, repeating them like a mantra, a lifeline that kept her grounded. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she clung to the possibility that this nightmare might finally be coming to an end. When the door opened once more, she glanced up expecting to see Officer Lynn. Instead, it was another officer, this one unfamiliar and indifferent. He informed her that she would need to spend the night in the holding cell. Her heart sank, but she forced herself to nod, gathering the last shreds of her composure as she followed him down the cold, sterile hallway. The holding cell was a small, cramped space with a narrow metal bench and a thin mattress. It was freezing, the chill seeping through her clothes and settling into her bones. She lay down, pulling her jacket tightly around herself, and closed her eyes, trying to block out the harsh reality of her surroundings. As she lay there, drifting in and out of restless sleep, she thought about her father, about the strength and resilience he had always tried to instill in her. She knew he would be furious if he knew what had happened, but she also knew that he would want her to stay strong, to hold on to her dignity. With that thought, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, to hold on to the small spark of hope Officer Lynn had given her. News of Amelia's arrest had reached her father, Captain Thomas Evans, late that night. He was at home reading case files in his study when the phone rang. The officer on the other end of the line spoke hesitantly, her voice low, detailing the circumstances of Amelia's detainment. Thomas felt his heart pound as he listened, his body going rigid with disbelief. His daughter, his Amelia, was sitting in a holding cell, accused of shoplifting. His pulse quickened with anger and worry as he tried to wrap his mind around the idea. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat, rushed to his car, and drove to the station. As he drove, his mind was flooded with questions and memories. He thought back to when Amelia was a little girl, to the moments when he taught her about fairness, about standing up for what was right. He'd raised her with strong values, always teaching her that if she stayed true to herself, she'd be able to overcome anything. But now, that very system he had trusted was holding his daughter like a common criminal. When Thomas entered the station, he felt a tension in the air. As he walked down the familiar hallways, officers greeted him with quiet nods, their expressions a mix of respect and discomfort. He wasn't sure if it was the sight of their captain here so late at night, or if they knew the reason he had come. Either way, he was determined to get to the bottom of it. He walked straight to the holding area, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Officer Lynn, who had been sitting at her desk nearby, stood up as soon as she saw him. She had been the only one who had shown Amelia any empathy that night, and now she looked at Thomas with a mixture of relief and hesitation. "Captain Evans," she greeted, her tone cautious. I'm glad you're here." Thomas gave her a brief nod, his expression firm. "I need to see my daughter, Officer Lynn," he said, his voice laced with a mix of urgency and frustration. Lynn hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before leaning in to speak quietly. "She's in holding, sir. I've been reviewing the case, and I believe there's been a misunderstanding. She shouldn't be here. I've tried to explain this to the other officers, but, well, you know how it is sometimes." Thomas clenched his jaw, understanding her implication. He knew all too well the insidious biases that sometimes lurked within the system, hidden in the shadows of procedure and protocol. It was a reality he'd fought against for years, trying to bring change from within, but now it was his daughter paying the price. "Thank you, Officer Lynn," he said, his voice barely masking his frustration. "I'll handle this from here." Lynn nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "Of course, sir. If you need any support with this, well, I'm here to help." With a grateful nod, Thomas proceeded down the hallway to the holding cells. He felt a weight pressing down on his shoulders, a mix of anger and protectiveness that he hadn't felt in years. He took a steadying breath as he approached Amelia's cell, his heart aching at the thought of seeing her in such a place. When he reached her cell, he saw her sitting on the narrow bench, her arms wrapped around herself as she tried to keep warm. She looked tired, worn down by the long hours of waiting, but there was a fierce resolve in her eyes. When she looked up and saw him, her expression softened, and she quickly stood up, moving closer to the bars. "Dad," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and frustration. "I can't believe I'm here." Thomas felt a surge of emotions rise within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Amelia," he said, his voice steady but firm, "are you all right?" She nodded, though he could see the exhaustion in her face. I'm fine. Just tired. I didn't do anything, Dad. I was just shopping. They They assumed things about me that weren't true." Thomas placed his hand on the cold metal bars, meeting her gaze with a fierce determination. "I believe you, Amelia, and I'm going to make sure everyone here understands that you don't belong in this cell. I'll get you out of here." She took a shaky breath, her voice low. "Thank you, Dad. I didn't know if anyone would listen." Thomas nodded, his expression resolute. He would do whatever it took to ensure she was treated fairly. This wasn't just about his daughter. It was about standing up to the biases that had plagued his department for years. He knew he couldn't ignore the fact that this was a fight he'd have to wage carefully, but he was prepared for it. Turning away from the cell, he motioned for one of the officers nearby to open the door. As Amelia was led out, Thomas took her arm gently, guiding her down the hallway. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, the silent judgments and curiosity. But he held his head high, his focus entirely on getting his daughter out of this place. Once they were back in his office, Thomas closed the door behind them, offering her a seat. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the strain of the ordeal weighing heavily on her shoulders. "Amelia, I need to understand everything that happened," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Every detail matters here." Amelia took a deep breath, recounting the events of the day. The store, the guard's accusatory behavior, the arrival of the police, and the series of humiliating questions she'd been forced to answer. As she spoke, Thomas's expression grew darker, his jaw tightening with each word. He could feel the anger boiling within him, but he kept his composure for her sake. When she finished, he sat back, processing everything she'd said. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said softly. I wish I could say this was a one-time thing, but it's not. This kind of treatment, it happens too often, and it's something I've been fighting against for a long time." Amelia looked at him, a mixture of anger and confusion in her eyes. "But Dad, how? How can this happen? I didn't do anything wrong. I thought the system was supposed to protect people." Thomas sighed, his expression weary. "The system is supposed to protect people, but sometimes it fails, and when it does, it's up to people like us to hold it accountable." She nodded, absorbing his words. There was a fire in her eyes now, a determination that mirrored his own. "So, what are we going to do about it?" Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, a fierce resolve in his gaze. "We're going to make sure that this never happens to you, or anyone else, again. I'm going to bring this up with the department heads, start an investigation into the conduct of the officers involved. And I'm not stopping until we get answers." He knew this was a dangerous move, one that could put his position at risk, but he was prepared to face whatever consequences came his way. Amelia deserved justice, and he was determined to see that she received it. Over the following days, Thomas launched an internal investigation, calling in the officers and the store guard who had been involved in Amelia's detainment. He conducted interviews, reviewed the case files, and scrutinized every detail, looking for any trace of bias or misconduct. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. His department had deeper issues, ones that had been festering for years. During one of the interviews, Thomas confronted the store guard, a man named Rick. The guard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly nervous under the captain's intense gaze. "Rick," Thomas began, his tone cold and professional, "I want to understand what led you to believe my daughter was involved in any criminal activity." Rick stammered, his eyes darting around the room. "Well, she looked like someone who'd been reported as a suspect, Captain. Young woman, same build, same, appearance. Thomas's expression hardened. Her appearance? He echoed, his voice dangerously quiet. You mean her race? Rick looked down, unable to meet Thomas's gaze. No, I thought I was just doing my job. Thomas leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Your job is to protect the people in that store, yes. But it is not your job to make baseless assumptions about people based on how they look. My daughter was humiliated, detained, and treated like a criminal for simply shopping, and that is unacceptable. Rick swallowed, visibly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Captain. I didn't mean— Thomas cut him off, his tone firm. Sorry isn't enough, Rick. We need to do better, and we will. The internal investigation extended beyond the guard. Thomas addressed his entire department, delivering a speech that left no room for ambiguity. He spoke about the importance of integrity, of respecting every citizen, regardless of race or background. He made it clear that this kind of prejudice had no place in his department. As he stood before his team, he could see the mixed reactions in their faces. Some looked uncomfortable, others resentful. But there were also those who seemed inspired, who understood the importance of what he was saying. And in that moment, Thomas knew that this was a battle worth fighting, not only for Amelia, but for every person who deserved fair and equal treatment under the law. After the meeting, Thomas found Amelia waiting for him in his office. She looked at him with a mixture of pride and gratitude, her earlier anger softened but still present. Thank you, Dad, she said quietly. I know this wasn't easy for you. Thomas smiled, his expression warm. It's never easy, Amelia, but some things are worth fighting for. She nodded, a look of determination in her eyes. And I'm going to fight, too, for myself and for anyone else who's ever been treated like I was. Together, they stood, united in their resolve to bring change, both within the department and in the wider world around them. For Amelia, this experience had ignited a fire, a desire to ensure that no one else would have to face the same injustice. And for Thomas, it was a reminder of the ideals he had dedicated his life to, ideals he would continue to uphold, no matter the challenges ahead. In the days following Thomas's impassioned speech to his department, he could feel the tension simmering around him. The internal investigation was underway, and the atmosphere in the station had shifted. Some officers regarded him with quiet respect, while others looked at him with disdain, their disapproval barely concealed. Thomas knew he was treading dangerous ground, but he felt resolute. This wasn't just about Amelia. It was about facing the truth and confronting the biases that had festered for too long within his own department. Meanwhile, Amelia returned to her routine, but she felt changed. Every time she walked down the street, every time she saw a security guard or a police officer, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. She couldn't ignore how quickly assumptions could strip someone of their dignity. Her trust in the system had been shaken, but like her father, she was determined to channel her anger into something constructive. One morning, Thomas received a call from the department's Internal Affairs Division, requesting that he come in for a meeting. He knew what this was about. Word had spread about his investigation, and it was clear that some were not pleased. Thomas prepared himself, gathering the evidence he had collected over the past week, records of complaints, witness statements, and a file on the guard who had wrongfully accused Amelia. When he arrived at the meeting, he was greeted by Captain Matthews, a high-ranking officer known for his strict adherence to procedure. Matthews offered Thomas a stiff nod, gesturing for him to take a seat across the polished conference table. Captain Evans, Matthews began, his tone measured. I've reviewed your request for an internal investigation, as well as your actions in the department over the past week. Let me be clear. We take accusations of misconduct very seriously, but I'm concerned about the way you're handling this. Thomas met Matthew's gaze evenly. With all due respect, Captain, I'm handling this in the only way I know how, by seeking the truth. Matthew's eyes narrowed slightly. There's a right way to go about these things, Thomas. Stirring up trouble in your own department without proper evidence isn't the answer. Thomas set the file on the table, his voice steady. This file contains documented complaints from individuals who've experienced similar treatment. Amelia's case is not an isolated incident. I'm committed to rooting out the biases that allowed this to happen. Matthews sighed, glancing at the file before looking back at Thomas. You're a good officer, Evans, one of the best. But I hope you realize the risk you're taking. We need to be cautious with accusations like these. They can damage reputations, hurt careers. Thomas interrupted, his tone unyielding. And what about the lives that are damaged when we ignore these issues? What about the people who are hurt, who lose faith in the very system that's supposed to protect them? Matthews leaned back, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he gave a brief nod. Very well, Captain Evans. You have my authorization to continue with the investigation, but keep it discreet. I don't want this turning into a public scandal. With that, the meeting concluded. Thomas left the room, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. He knew this was just the beginning, and he was prepared to face whatever resistance came his way. As the investigation continued, Thomas conducted a series of interviews with the officers involved in Amelia's case. Each interview revealed different perspectives and subtle nuances, but a pattern began to emerge. Some officers dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding, while others struggled to explain their actions, their discomfort palpable. Thomas could sense the tension in their voices, the subtle justifications that hinted at deeper biases. When he finally reached Officer Rick, the store security guard who had reported Amelia, the man's demeanor was defensive from the start. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Look, Captain, Rick began, his tone a mix of frustration and defiance. I did what I thought was right. We've had a series of thefts lately, and she fit the description. Young, about her height, same appearance. Thomas's expression remained stern as he listened. He had heard these justifications before, but hearing them directed toward his own daughter cut deeper. He felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice steady. Appearance, he repeated, his tone firm. You mean her race? Rick hesitated, then shrugged, unwilling to fully admit it. Look, we have a duty to protect our store. If that means being cautious, then so be it. Thomas leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. And what about the duty to treat every customer fairly, to avoid making baseless accusations based on how someone looks? My daughter was humiliated, treated like a criminal. You made assumptions without evidence, and those assumptions have consequences. Rick's eyes dropped to the table, his defensive posture faltering. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was just doing my job. Doing your job doesn't mean you have the right to treat people unfairly, Thomas replied, his voice hard. This isn't just about Amelia. It's about the way we interact with everyone. We are entrusted with the responsibility to protect and serve, not to judge based on preconceived notions. Rick muttered a reluctant apology, but Thomas knew it was only surface-level remorse. Deep-seated biases couldn't be changed overnight. Still, he hoped that this experience would make Rick, and others like him, think twice in the future. The culmination of the investigation came a week later when Thomas held a department meeting to address the findings. He stood at the front of the room, facing his team, some of whom were visibly uncomfortable. Others looked at him with curiosity, and a few nodded in quiet approval, knowing the importance of what he was about to say. Over the past few weeks, Thomas began, his voice strong and steady, we've been conducting an internal review to examine how we, as a department, handle our interactions with the public. This investigation was prompted by a specific incident, but it has revealed broader issues we can't afford to ignore. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. We have a responsibility, not just to enforce the law, but to uphold the values of respect, fairness, and integrity. These values mean nothing if we allow bias to cloud our judgment. Every individual we encounter deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of appearance, race, or background. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Thomas looked around, meeting the eyes of his officers one by one. He could see the mixture of reactions. Some officers looked away, others nodded in agreement, and a few seemed to understand the gravity of what he was saying. I know that change isn't easy, Thomas continued, and I know that some of you may feel uncomfortable with what I'm saying, but we cannot ignore the reality of prejudice. It's our duty to confront it, to root it out, and to ensure that we serve and protect all members of our community equally. As he finished speaking, he felt a surge of pride mixed with determination. He knew this speech wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a step forward, a spark that he hoped would ignite a shift in mindset. After the meeting, several officers approached him expressing their support and appreciation. They shared stories of moments when they too had witnessed or experienced bias, and Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was possible, but it required collective effort, honesty, and accountability. When Thomas returned home that evening, he found Amelia waiting for him in the kitchen, her expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet pride. "So, how did it go?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for clues. Thomas sighed, a weary smile crossing his face. "It went well, I think. Some people were resistant, of course, but others, they understood. It's a start." Amelia nodded, her own expression serious. "Thank you, Dad, for standing up for me, for standing up for what's right." Thomas reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's my job, not just as a father, but as a captain, as a person who believes in justice. You deserved better, and I'm going to make sure that we, as a department, do better." She smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I want to be part of this, Dad. I want to help make things better, too." Thomas felt a surge of pride at her words. Amelia's resilience, her courage, and her commitment to justice filled him with hope for the future. Together, they were stronger, united in their fight for a system that would truly serve and protect everyone. In that moment, Thomas realized that this journey was far from over, but he was ready. He was ready to stand beside his daughter, to fight for change, and to build a legacy of integrity and respect, not just for Amelia, but for all those who deserved justice. Thank you for being with us. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and skip to other videos. There's a lot more to come. Write in the comments what video impressed you the most.